On the very first day of the semester at one of the country's most prestigious universities, the lecture hall buzzed with nervous excitement. Students filled the seats, eager yet anxious about what lay ahead, especially those who had heard rumors about Professor Stoneheart. He was a tall, imposing man in his late 50s, known for his sharp tongue, unforgiving standards, and a deep disdain for mediocrity. But what he was most notorious for was his tendency to single out students during lectures, often those he deemed unremarkable, and grill them with brutally difficult questions in front of everyone. To him, it was a way to separate the truly brilliant from the weak. As he scanned the room that morning, his eyes locked onto a young woman sitting quietly in the second row, Samantha Ampo. She had just transferred from a university in the Philippines, and though she sat with poise, there was a quiet tension in her shoulders. Her notebook lay neatly open, her pen ready, but her face gave nothing away. To Professor Stoneheart, she was the perfect target, an unfamiliar name, a foreign student, probably timid and unprepared. Without a second thought, he called out sharply, "Miss Ampo, tell us, what are the foundational principles of quantum entanglement, and how do they relate to Bell's theorem?" The room fell silent. Several students winced, knowing that even they, despite having studied under Stoneheart for months, would struggle with such a complex, high-level question. A few exchanged glances, expecting the girl to stammer or falter. But Samantha didn't blink. Though her heart pounded in her chest, she took a steady breath, stood up, and raised her chin with quiet determination. She had faced challenges before, this was just another one. As Samantha rose from her seat, all eyes turned to her, some expectant, others skeptical. Her palms were slightly damp, and her heart pounded with the weight of the moment, but she drew in a deep breath and stepped forward, her posture straight and composed. She glanced briefly at Professor Stoneheart, whose cold gaze hadn't wavered. The silence in the lecture hall was heavy, as if the room itself were waiting for her to fail. But then she began to speak, her voice low but steady. "Quantum entanglement," she started, her tone gradually gaining confidence, "is a physical phenomenon where pairs or groups of particles become so deeply connected that the state of one instantly influences the state of the other, even across vast distances. It's as if they're communicating beyond space and time." There was a shift in the room, students who had been staring blankly now sat up straighter. She continued, her mind sharp and focused, "This challenges classical notions of locality. Bell's theorem, formulated in 1964, provides a way to test whether local hidden variable theories can explain the strange correlations seen in quantum mechanics. And they can't, not entirely." She paced slightly as she spoke, not out of nervousness now, but because the ideas in her mind were rushing forward, too quickly to remain still. Her hands moved to emphasize her points, her eyes lit with intensity. Bell proposed inequalities that any local theory must satisfy. But quantum experiments, again and again, violate those inequalities. That tells us the universe is non-local at a fundamental level. Einstein called it spooky action at a distance, but it's real. It's been tested and proven. Professor Stoneheart, known for his merciless critiques, leaned forward slightly. His piercing eyes were no longer just cold, they were intrigued. The usual condescension on his face had faded, replaced by a flicker of curiosity. Samantha noticed it, and it gave her strength. She pressed on, referencing the 1982 aspect experiment, and even the 2015 Delft experiment that closed the loopholes in Bell tests. When she finally stopped speaking, a hush fell over the room. Her breathing was a little uneven, but her gaze was calm. There were no smug smiles from the professor, no sharp criticisms. Only silence. Then, after a long pause, Professor Stoneheart gave a slight nod, subtle, but unmistakable. Samantha felt the tension in her chest ease. She had not only answered the question, she had earned his respect. As the lecture came to an end, the room slowly stirred back to life. Chairs creaked, notebooks snapped shut, and the low hum of conversation rose among the students. Yet Samantha remained seated, her fingers loosely intertwined on the desk, her mind still swimming in the aftermath of what had just happened. Her heart was still beating faster than usual, though the intensity of the moment had started to fade. For a few seconds, She just sat there in silence, replaying every word she had said, every glance from Professor Stoneheart, every breath she had taken under the weight of his scrutiny. She had expected humiliation, or at least indifference, but what she had received was something entirely different: acknowledgement. Her trance was broken by a familiar voice. "That was incredible," whispered Lily as she slid into the seat next to her, eyes wide with admiration. "You didn't just survive up there, you owned it." Samantha turned to her friend, blinking in surprise. "Do you really think so?" she asked, her voice quiet, still unsure of whether she had imagined the whole thing. "Are you kidding?" "Everyone was hanging on your every word," Lily said, glancing around at the lingering students. Even Stoneheart looked impressed. "That never happens." Samantha allowed a small smile to form on her lips. Her shoulders, which had been tense the entire hour, slowly relaxed. "I was terrified," she admitted. "My hands were shaking so badly I thought I'd drop my notes." Lily laughed. "Well, you didn't. You looked calm, confident, like you belonged up there." They gathered their things and stood up, walking toward the exit as conversations buzzed around them. For the first time since Samantha joined the class, she noticed the way others looked at her, less with judgment and more with curiosity, maybe even a touch of respect. A few students nodded subtly at her as she passed, and she could hear faint murmurs behind her name. Just as they were about to leave the hallway, footsteps approached quickly from behind. Samantha turned around, heart skipping. It was Professor Stoneheart. He stopped just a few feet from her, his presence commanding as always. But there was something different in his expression, less icy, more intentional. "Miss Carter," he said, meeting her eyes. "Your response today was articulate, well-reasoned, and delivered with clarity. That's something I don't say often. I expect to see more of that from you." Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, his coat swaying behind him. Samantha stood frozen, her mouth slightly open in disbelief. Lily let out a stunned laugh. "Did that just happen? He complimented you? In public?" Samantha finally breathed out and nodded, her eyes bright with a new spark. "Yeah," she whispered, a sense of quiet pride blooming in her chest. "I think I'm finally starting to believe I belong here." And for the first time since stepping into that intimidating lecture hall, she did. That night, after the day's chaos had faded into a quiet stillness, Samantha found herself unable to sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling with her arms crossed beneath her head, trying to calm the whirlwind of thoughts that refused to quiet. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of the leaves outside her window, swaying in the breeze, and the distant hum of the city, but they did nothing to soothe her restless mind. Her mind was alive, replaying the events of the day over and over, as if she could somehow find more meaning or clarity in the tiny details she had already processed 100 times. The moment with Professor Stoneheart kept replaying in her mind. She had entered his office expecting to be dismissed quickly, to hear that her proposal needed more work or, worse yet, that it wasn't worth pursuing at all. But instead, she had felt a strange sense of validation when he gave her his full attention, listened intently to every word, and asked questions that showed genuine interest in her thoughts. The shock of it still lingered, leaving her heart pounding and her cheeks flushed even in the quiet of her room. She could still remember how his sharp eyes softened, how his words had been calm but encouraging, telling her she was on the right track. She had always doubted herself, always felt like an outsider in a space that was supposed to be her own. She had spent so many hours second-guessing her ideas, questioning her abilities, and fearing that others would see her for what she truly felt she was, an imposter. And yet, today, Professor Stoneheart had seen something in her. It was as if the veil of self-doubt had been lifted for just a moment, and she could see herself clearly for the first time. She wasn't perfect, she wasn't always right, but she was capable. She had something to offer. Samantha tossed and turned, pulling the blanket up over her shoulders, trying to shake off the overwhelming mix of emotions that flooded her chest. She felt a warmth spreading through her, a mix of pride and disbelief. Could it really be true? Was she really being seen, finally? Her eyes stung with the hint of unshed tears. It felt like a long time since anyone had truly acknowledged her in a way that made her feel validated, not just as a student, but as a person with ideas worth listening to. But there was also fear that it was all a fluke, a temporary moment of grace that wouldn't last. What if tomorrow, when she stepped back into the classroom, the weight of her insecurities came crashing down again? What if the praise was just a rare accident, and Professor Stoneheart would go back to overlooking her? What if she failed to live up to this unexpected moment of recognition? Samantha squeezed her eyes shut, trying to push the fear aside. She told herself to breathe, to focus on the fact that this moment was hers, no matter how fleeting. She was allowed to feel proud of herself, allowed to let the kindness and validation sink in. She wasn't going to erase it, not this time. Finally, as the clock ticked past midnight and the room grew colder, she allowed herself to drift into a fitful sleep, the echoes of the day still clinging to her like a soft, lingering melody. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't even have a clear plan for what came next. But for the first time in a long while, Samantha felt like she was on the verge of something bigger than herself. Something worth chasing. The following morning, Samantha entered the university building with a sense of anticipation that almost felt foreign to her. As she walked through the hallway, the sounds of students chatting, the clatter of shoes on the hard floor, and the hum of conversations around her all seemed more vivid, as though she had just awakened from a long slumber. It was as if the weight she had carried for months had been suddenly lifted, leaving her feeling lighter, almost buoyant. She had felt invisible for so long, drifting through her days in a haze of uncertainty and self-doubt. But today, she felt different. There was a spark of hope inside her that refused to be dimmed, a sense of purpose that was growing louder with every step she took. As she approached Professor Stoneheart's office later that morning, her nerves began to return, swirling in her stomach like a storm. The thought of facing him again was intimidating, to say the least. He had been the source of both her self-doubt and her inspiration. Yesterday's conversation had left her with mixed emotions, a whirlwind of validation mixed with the realization that she had to prove herself, that her work needed to speak for itself. As she stood outside his office, she could almost hear her heart beating in her ears, and she was torn between the urge to run away or to press forward with the same boldness that she had felt the moment she left the conversation the day before. She could feel the tension rising in her shoulders, and her hands were slightly trembling. But then, she reminded herself, this is what you wanted. This was her opportunity, the one that had been given to her by Professor Stoneheart himself. The validation he had offered was not just a fleeting compliment, it was a sign that she was capable of achieving something bigger, something meaningful. She had already made a promise to herself to stop holding back, to stop hiding in the shadows of her own insecurity. She couldn't afford to let fear control her now. With a deep, steadying breath, Samantha knocked on the door, her hand feeling heavier than usual on the cold metal of the handle. When she heard his voice calling her in, she hesitated for just a moment, her nerves nearly overwhelming her. But then she took one more breath, straightened her posture, and stepped inside. "Good morning, Professor," she said, keeping her voice calm, though she could feel the anxiety pulsing in her chest. "Ah, Samantha," he replied, looking up from a pile of papers on his desk. "I trust you've had some time to reflect on our discussion from yesterday." Samantha's mind raced as she stepped further into the office, trying to recall every word, every thought she had during their last conversation. She had spent hours the previous night revisiting the ideas they had discussed, refining her thoughts, and preparing for this moment. But now, standing in front of him again, her mind felt strangely empty. All the words that had seemed so clear just hours ago were now elusive, slipping through her fingers. Her palms began to sweat, and she could feel the old, familiar rush of self-doubt creeping in, threatening to silence her. But Samantha wasn't about to let that happen. She knew this moment was crucial, and she had no intention of letting fear take control. She had worked too hard to get here. She had spent so many years doubting herself, questioning her abilities, but now she had a chance to prove that she was more than the quiet, uncertain student who had been content to hide behind the walls of her own insecurities. "Yes, Professor," she replied, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "I've thought a lot about our conversation, and I've made some changes to my proposal. I'm ready to take the next step, and I'd like to share my updated ideas with you. Professor Stonehart's gaze sharpened slightly, but there was no hint of judgment in his eyes, only curiosity. His attention seemed to shift entirely toward her, his posture leaning slightly forward as he set the papers aside. I'm listening, he said, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable weight. Samantha took a deep breath, feeling the rush of adrenaline in her veins. This was it. She had a moment to prove herself. For once, she wasn't just trying to please him or make him see her as competent, she was speaking from a place of conviction, of belief in her own potential. As she began to explain the changes she had made to her proposal, she found herself speaking with a clarity and confidence that surprised her. The words flowed more freely than they had before, and with each sentence, her nervousness seemed to fade, replaced by the excitement of sharing something she truly believed in. Her passion for the work, the hours of research, and the late nights spent refining her ideas all poured into her words. She could see Professor Stonehart nodding along, his expression thoughtful, but there was no longer that distance between them, no longer that intimidating air that had once made her feel small. When she finished speaking, there was a long pause. Samantha stood there, holding her breath, her mind racing with questions. Had she said enough? Had she made her case? Would he approve of the changes she'd made, or would he dismiss them as naive? Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Professor Stonehart spoke. Well done, Samantha, he said, his voice carrying an unexpected warmth. This is exactly the kind of initiative I was hoping to see from you. Keep pushing forward with this. You're on the right track. A wave of relief washed over her, and for a moment, her legs felt weak beneath her. She hadn't realized how tense she had been until the tension melted away, replaced by a feeling of accomplishment. His approval was more than just a mark of success, it was a validation of everything she had worked for, everything she had fought to overcome. As she turned to leave his office, Samantha felt a strange mix of emotions swirling inside her. There was relief, yes, but also a quiet sense of pride. For the first time, she felt like she had earned something, not by seeking approval or confirmation, but by standing firm in her own abilities. She wasn't just a student anymore, she was someone with ideas worth listening to, someone capable of making an impact. Walking back through the hallways of the university, her heart still racing with the excitement of the conversation, Samantha couldn't help but smile. The path ahead of her was still uncertain, but for the first time, she felt confident in taking the next step. Whatever came next, she knew she was ready.